In a few hours, my daughter will look at me within earshot of a room full of guests and say, very calmly, "Maybe you'd be more comfortable upstairs." The strange part is that I will have been awake since 4:30 that morning, cooking Christmas dinner in the house I have owned since 1993. When I think back on it now, the day itself did not begin with anger. It began the way most of my Christmas mornings have begun for more than 30 years. My name is Aurora Hastings. I woke before dawn on Christmas morning and went straight to the kitchen. The turkey went into the oven first. After that, I started the cranberry sauce using the same recipe my mother wrote down on an old index card in 1978. The card is stained and slightly curled, but I have never replaced it. Some things feel better when they stay the same. The house sits on the hillside above Lake Superior in Duluth. My husband and I bought it in 1993 when Chloe was still in elementary school. We barely managed the mortgage back then, though we never regretted it. This year, the dinner was a little different. My daughter Chloe had invited several people from her consulting business. I didn't object. I assumed she wanted to introduce them to the house, and I was glad to cook. By the middle of the afternoon, I heard Chloe talking to someone in the living room. "Mom prefers to focus on the cooking these days," she said. "I usually help coordinate the rest." I paused for a moment while I was slicing bread. It struck me as an odd thing to say, though I told myself I might have misunderstood. A few minutes later, I walked into the dining room to check the table. The place cards had already been set out. My seat, at the head of the table where I had sat every Christmas since my husband died, had someone else's name on it. I stood there looking at it longer than I meant to. I remember thinking, quietly to myself, that something had shifted in this house and I had not noticed when it happened. That moment stayed with me as the evening approached. And by the time the guests arrived, I had begun to understand that the dinner Chloe was planning might not unfold the way I had expected. 14 months ago, Chloe and Mark stood on my porch in the pouring rain, looking like a pair of broken plans. "Just 3 or 4 months, Mom," she promised. Until the business stabilizes, I didn't hesitate. Helping Chloe was a reflex I had practiced for decades. She didn't have to ask because I had already spent years clearing her path selling my anniversary ring to finish her MBA tuition and draining my retirement savings to erase her $18,000 credit card debt in Chicago. Love, I believed, didn't need receipts. I spent those first few days clearing the guest room and putting fresh flowers on the dresser, welcoming them into a temporary sanctuary. They moved in that spring with stacked boxes and restless cats, promising to cover groceries and utilities while they got back on their feet. I believed her. I didn't realize then that when you give someone an inch without a contract, they eventually start measuring the whole house for themselves. The 3 months quietly bled into a year, and the gratitude turned into a slow, silent takeover. The first change was small enough that I almost convinced myself it didn't matter. One morning, I walked into the living room and noticed the throw pillows had been moved. 2 of them, the ones my husband brought back from Mackinac Island years ago, were sitting on the armchair in the corner instead of the sofa. I put them back where they had always been. Later that afternoon, Chloe walked in, glanced at the couch, and smiled slightly. "I had those arranged differently," she told me. "I know," I replied. "I moved them back. It just flows better the other way," she added, like she was explaining a design decision. I nodded and left it alone. At the time, it didn't seem worth discussing. People adjust things when they move into a space. That's normal. A week later, I noticed something else. The framed photograph that usually sat on the mantel was gone. It was a picture of my husband and me standing near Lake Superior the summer we bought the house. I eventually found it set behind a chair in the sewing room, as if someone had moved it quickly and expected I wouldn't notice right away. In its place hung a large abstract print. When I asked Chloe about it, she looked over her shoulder from the dining table. "I thought the room needed something more modern," she explained. I didn't argue. I simply took the photo out of the closet and placed it back on the mantel. A few days after that, I was in the kitchen when I heard Chloe talking to Mark in the hallway. If I'm going to host clients here, she was explaining, the house needs to look more professional. Mark hesitated. It's still your mom's place. I know, Chloe replied, a little too quickly. I'm just trying to make it work better. I stayed where I was, listening for another moment before turning back to the sink. That was the first time I understood something had shifted. Chloe wasn't just adjusting a few things around the house. She was beginning to imagine it differently. The kitchen changed next. I noticed it early one morning when I reached for my favorite mug. It's a ceramic cup Chloe made at summer camp when she was 12. The shape isn't even, and the handle tilts slightly to one side, but I've kept it at the front of the cabinet for years. That morning it wasn't there. I checked the shelf again and eventually found it pushed behind a row of identical white mugs I didn't recognize. Chloe walked into the kitchen while I was holding it. Oh, she said, glancing at the cabinet. I reorganized that yesterday. I placed the mug on the counter. Why move this one? The matching set looks cleaner, she explained. It's more functional if everything's uniform. I looked at the mug for a moment before putting it back in the front of the cabinet. That one stays here, I told her quietly. She watched me close the door and gave a small shrug. Okay, she replied, though her tone suggested she thought the conversation was unnecessary. Later that afternoon, I noticed Chloe had posted a photograph of the kitchen online. The counters were wiped down, the new mugs lined up neatly. The caption read, "Finally getting our kitchen organized." Within a few minutes, someone commented, "Your place looks beautiful." I stared at the screen longer than I meant to. Your place. Not my mother's house. Not Aurora's kitchen. Just Chloe's place. Mark happened to be standing near the refrigerator when I set my phone down. He glanced toward the cabinet and then toward Chloe. Maybe we should ask your mom before moving things, he said carefully. Chloe waved the comment off. It's not a big deal, she replied. I didn't respond. But standing there in my own kitchen, I realized something important had already begun to change. It wasn't about the mug. It was about who believed they had the right to move it. The sewing room was the first place where I tried to draw a clear line. It's a small room near the back of the hallway. After my husband died, I started using it for quilting. The work kept my hands busy during evenings that felt too quiet. Over time, the room became something steady in the house, a place that still felt completely mine. One afternoon, Chloe leaned against the doorway while I was sorting fabric. Mom, could I use this room as an office for a while, she asked, just until my business grows a little. I didn't hesitate. No, I told her. I need this room. She nodded quickly. Okay, I get it. 3 days later, I opened the door and stopped. 2 computer monitors had been set up on my sewing table. My fabric bins were stacked in the corner, and Mark was crouched near the wall, plugging in cables. He looked uncomfortable the moment I opened the door. It was obvious the room had been changed in a hurry, and just as obvious that no one intended to ask me first. What happened in here, I asked. He shifted his weight and looked toward the floor. She's under a lot of pressure with the business, he explained quietly. She just needed a workspace. I stepped inside the room. I already told her no. Chloe appeared behind him a moment later. Oh, she said, noticing my expression. I was going to talk to you about that. You did talk to me, I replied. I answered. She gave a quick apology and promised to move things back. I asked twice more that week when the equipment would be removed. Each time Chloe said she only needed a little longer. After that, every reminder turned into the same answer in different words, until the delay itself became the arrangement. But the monitors stayed, not for a few hours, for 6 weeks. During that time, I realized something uncomfortable about the way Chloe handled boundaries. She didn't argue with them directly. Instead, she acted as though they had never been set in the first place. And I had spent months trying to maintain peace in a situation where silence was quietly working against me. By the end of summer, the arrangement that was supposed to last 3 or 4 months had quietly stretched much longer. One evening while Chloe was working at the dining table, I finally asked the question I had been putting off. "Have you started looking for apartments yet?" She kept typing for a moment before answering. "Soon," she replied. That was all. Mark was sitting on the couch nearby, reading something on his phone. He glanced in our direction but didn't speak. I let the moment pass. At the time, it felt easier than turning it into an argument. Weeks went by. Nothing changed. In November, after putting the conversation off too long, I asked them both to sit down with me at the kitchen table. I had written a few notes beforehand because I wanted to say things clearly and only once. "I'm glad I could help when things were difficult," I began, "but we need to talk about the next step." Chloe folded her hands in front of her. Mark leaned back slightly in his chair. "The sewing room is staying as it was," I continued. "And from now on, changes in the house need to be discussed first." Chloe nodded in a calm, practiced way. "Of course, Mom." I kept going. "And it's time to start looking for an apartment." Mark exhaled slowly, like someone who had been waiting for the conversation. Chloe offered a small smile. "We appreciate everything you've done," she told me. "We'll start figuring things out." For a moment, I felt relieved. The conversation had been direct, and neither of them had argued. About a week later, I walked past Chloe's laptop while she stepped out to take a call. An email window was open. The subject line read, "Christmas dinner at our place." Beneath the subject line was her note to the guests, "Looking forward to hosting you all here." That was the part I couldn't explain away. I stood there longer than I meant to. Our place. It was a small phrase, but it carried more certainty than anything Chloe had said at the table the week before. At that point, I understood something clearly. Chloe wasn't just staying in the house. She had already begun telling other people it belonged to her. The dining room looked different the day before the dinner. I walked in during the afternoon and immediately noticed the centerpiece I make every Christmas sitting on the floor beside the sideboard. It's a simple arrangement with pine branches and a pair of small brass reindeer my husband bought during our first year in this house. In its place was a narrow glass arrangement with white candles. I stood there for a moment before picking up my centerpiece and placing it back in the middle of the table. That was when I noticed the place cards. Chloe had set them neatly at every seat. I scanned them slowly. The chair at the head of the table, where I had always sat during Christmas dinner, had a card with Mark's name written on it. Chloe walked in a moment later and stopped when she saw the table. I had that arranged a certain way. She told me. "I know," I replied. She stepped closer to the table. It made more sense for Mark to sit there. She continued, "He'll be greeting people when they come in." I moved the place card aside and set my centerpiece down again. "My house," I told her calmly. "My table." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Mark entered from the hallway and looked at both of us. "Maybe it doesn't matter where anyone sits," he offered carefully. Chloe crossed her arms. "It does if we're hosting professionals," she replied. I noticed the word immediately. Hosting. I adjusted the chairs back into their usual positions and straightened the tablecloth. At that point, something became very clear to me. The dinner Chloe was planning wasn't only about celebrating Christmas. It was about presenting the house to other people as if she were the person in charge of it. And by the way she spoke, she had already decided how that evening would look. Guests began arriving a little after 6. Chloe greeted them in the living room while I finished bringing food from the kitchen. By that point, I had been cooking since 4:30 that morning. The turkey was resting on the counter, and I was still wearing the same apron I had put on before sunrise. Mark carried plates to the dining table while a few of Chloe's guests stood nearby talking about work. I didn't recognize most of them, though they nodded politely when we passed each other in the hallway. I lifted the turkey platter and walked toward the dining room. That was when Chloe stepped into the kitchen doorway. "You've done enough tonight," She told me in a calm, professional tone I had heard her use with clients on the phone. I paused and waited. She glanced toward the dining room where everyone was taking their seats. "Maybe you'd be more comfortable upstairs," she continued. "You've had a long day." There was no place set for me upstairs. No tray, no second table. Nothing that suggested I was meant to eat at all. If I went, I would simply disappear from the meal I had spent all day preparing. The room behind her grew quiet in a way that felt deliberate. A few people looked down at the table as if they weren't sure where to look. I held the platter a little tighter than I meant to. It wasn't the words themselves that struck me. It was how casually she delivered them, like she was offering a practical suggestion. In that moment, I understood exactly what she was doing. If I walked upstairs now, everyone sitting at that table would naturally assume Chloe was the one hosting the evening, and I would become something else in the house I had owned for more than 30 years. I had walked those rooms for decades before Chloe ever thought of managing anyone's table but her own. I set the turkey platter down on the dining table and untied my apron. No one spoke while I folded it and placed it on the counter. The house had gone strangely quiet, the kind of quiet that happens when people realize a moment is about to turn into something else. Then I walked into the dining room. The chair at the head of the table was still slightly pushed back from when Chloe had arranged the seating earlier. I pulled it out the rest of the way and sat down. Several of Chloe's guests exchanged quick glances. I reached for the carving knife and looked around the table. "Thank you all for coming to my home. I bought this house in 1993, and I intend to be the one serving from this table for many more years to come." For a second, no one moved. Then a woman sitting near the end of the table leaned forward. "That smells incredible," she commented, gesturing toward the turkey. "It's the same recipe I've used every Christmas," I replied while carving the first slice. "My mother taught me when I was about 20. The tension in the room shifted slightly. Plates were passed around. Another guest nodded toward the cranberry sauce. "Did you make that too?" "I did," I answered. "The recipe goes back to 1978. As the conversation began to move, I rested my hand briefly on the edge of the table. "My husband rebuilt this table in 1997, I explained. The original legs cracked during a move. One of the guests looked between me and Chloe. "Oh," she said slowly. "I didn't realize Chloe and Mark were staying with you." Chloe didn't respond immediately. Mark cleared his throat from the opposite side of the table. "It's Aurora's home," he said quietly. "We're staying here for a while." A few people nodded, the situation settling into something clearer. Dinner continued after that. No one raised their voice. No one argued. I simply served the meal the way I had done for decades. And little by little, the room adjusted itself around that fact. Later that night, after the guests had left and the dishes were stacked beside the sink, Chloe and Mark came into the living room. I had already taken off my apron and was sitting on the same chair I usually use after long dinners. Chloe spoke first. "You embarrassed me tonight." I looked at her for a moment before answering. "I hosted dinner in my own home. That wasn't the point." She replied quickly. "Those people were business contacts." Mark shifted in his seat but didn't interrupt. I kept my voice steady. "We need to talk about something more important." Chloe crossed her arms. "About what you and Mark need to make plans to be out by the end of February. I'll put it in writing tomorrow." The words stayed in the room for a few seconds. "You're overreacting," Chloe said. Mark looked toward her and shook his head slowly. "No," he told her. "She isn't." The conversation ended shortly after that. No one raised their voice again. Sometimes the most serious decisions are made in very quiet moments. It took several tense weeks, 2 apartment viewings, and more silence than conversation. But by the 3rd week of February, they had signed a lease across town and started packing. The rent was higher than they expected, and Chloe had to take on freelance consulting work again instead of expanding the business the way she planned. Over the following months, Chloe mentioned more than once that a few of the business contacts from that dinner had stopped responding the way they used to. I don't know what they said to each other afterward. I only know people notice more than we think they do. About 3 months later, Chloe sent me a short text. "I'm sorry for how things went," I answered politely, "but honesty takes time to rebuild. And so does respect." That spring, I returned to the sewing room and started working on a quilt. I thought about giving it to Chloe one day, not as an apology, and not as a peace offering, just something made carefully by hand. That winter taught me something I should have remembered sooner. Kindness without boundaries doesn't stay kindness for very long. If this story meant something to you, leave a like or share your thoughts below. Sometimes hearing how other people handle moments like these helps more than we expect. For now, the house is quiet again, and that quiet feels earned.